Starting it now. We also want to make sure that the board's work is supporting staff, especially management, in achieving success in the implementation of the mission and the achievement of the vision that we set out in the strategic plan. So this webinar is really to drive these four elements in making things around the board table, making all the actions support performance. So we're going to go through what is governance, very high level, the ultimate role of the board members, and so what's expected through the legislative framework when we do talk about board mandate, the role of the officers, including the executive director, and then we're just going to dive into the four ways the board can contribute to organizational performance through fostering a culture of accountability, a healthy one, anyways, maintaining board efficiencies and effectiveness, and also ensuring effective communication between management, the board of directors, and other stakeholders, and also supporting the success of board committees that get things done between meetings. And once board committees are really effective in their work, they're becoming a model for the organization to perform as well, because they're showing that not only volunteers around a board table can make things happen, but we're going to be a model and expect the same from organizations, from the organization team members. So what is governance? And we're going to bring a few definitions in here so we can relate to them as we move along through this webinar. And governance is really simple. It's a set of tools, mechanisms, structures, and practices that allow the board of directors to make the very best possible decisions in the organization's interest, which is what's in the legislative framework really explains in detail that the board's work is to serve the organization. It's to ensure that the organization is well managed through oversight, and sometimes when it's a small nonprofit, it's actually through managing the organization properly. So all decisions is for the good of the organization, and that must be the driver. The board doesn't act for clients, it doesn't act for members, it acts on behalf of members for the good of the organization. The second one is to ensure that the sound organizational conduct and the good governance establishes operations that support the organization in meeting its fiduciary obligations, whether it's financial, legal, or ethical, and also fulfill its social responsibilities when it's a nonprofit. But in the end, there's oversight to be done, and we need to ensure that the organization is following the law, is meeting expectations when it comes to regulatory frameworks or legislative frameworks. And in the end, good governance is the foundations for a healthy culture of accountability in the organization, and through due diligence and maintaining a reasonable assurance that things are going well, they're on track in the organization, and by meeting that level of knowledge by the board that things are going well, then you are creating that culture of accountability, because what you're expecting from management, whether it's the executive director or some other managers in the organization, when they're reporting to the board, they need to report the information that will give them this reasonable assurance that things are on track, and also give them the information so they can practice due diligence and meet their fiduciary obligation when it comes to due diligence, and ensure that they are protected in their work as well. So we are able to move forward in a good governance model, is the groundwork for great decisions. It's a groundwork to make sure that the organization is meeting all of its legal obligations, and in the end, it's also on track, on mission, on vision, and respecting the values of the organization. And that's what governance creates. It's a system that has oversight on the organization to ensure that it's doing all of these things simultaneously. So let's talk about two groups of people that sit around the table. And in the legislative framework, whether it's in Canada or in Quebec or elsewhere in different provinces, most laws will say the same thing. The officers are the people who are responsible for individual management, high-level management responsibilities. That's going to include the executive director, the chair of the board, the treasurer, the secretary, the VP, and the responsibilities that they have. The officers are high-level managers, and whether they're volunteer around the board, sometimes they will be named by the board of directors. Sometimes they will be directors as well. So the role for officers is it's really being at the service of the board and the organization. It's a leadership and mobilization role. So if we talk about the treasurer, for example, the person in that seat has the responsibility to mobilize CFO or director of finance, executive director, other board members, mobilize with the auditor, the accountant, and ensure that the work of the treasurer, the finance and audit committee can actually have all the information needed so the board can make the very best financial decisions and report to members at the AGM on the fiduciary duty when it comes to money, when it comes to finances, to financing, and so on and so forth. Also, officers are taking responsibility for one of the board's key areas or files. And this is a key component here because we tend to think, well, they're just volunteers and we need to treat them as such and so on. And even though that's true, they also have an extra fiduciary duty as an officer that they also need to be able to lead a specific file, whether it's governance, compliance, finance, audit, whether it's the CEO and their management, and support and evaluate the CEO as well, or the executive director. The people in the officers' roles, and that's quite clear in the legislative framework, need to be able to very clearly have the competencies to do that work. So doesn't have to be deep. You don't need to be a CPA to be a treasurer on a board of directors, but you need to be able to read a ledger. You need to be able to read a budget. You need to be able to lead decisions and analysis when it comes to finance in the organization. And as we work towards that, we're going to create these roles, give them not only the resources, but also the financial resources. Will also give them the human resources to be able to do so, whether it's the treasurer with the support of the inside accountant or outside legal counsel when it comes to finance or governance. We're going to give them the resources so they can do their work. Plus, we're going to ask directors to sit on those committees to support the work that's being done between meetings, between board meetings, to get all of those job sites moving forward, whether it's in governance, whether it's in finance, or whether it's in supporting and evaluating and compensation committee of the CEO. Also, they take on responsibilities, not authority, and I think that's a key component when it comes to officers. Even though they have the big titles, there's much more responsibility that's tacked on to their role than authority. Their authority really comes through acting as a group, assuming the leadership role that they have, and also delivering on the promise of good governance, good finance, and good assessment and compensation of the executive director. And in the case of the other officer, the executive director is also an officer of the board. This person will be supported through either a management team or employees and resources to deliver on the promise of the mission, the vision, and the exemplary practice of the values. It also, and we need to note it because I think it's a key component when you are an officer on a board, whether it's chair, treasurer, secretary, you're carrying additional workload. So you can't just jump onto the title and say, I want that on my business card. I also need to be able to say, well, I'm committed to delivering on coordinating the finance committee or coordinating the governance committee, leading that work reporting to the board on the work of that committee. So the role of the officer is a much more than just a title that's tacked on to your volunteer title, but you have director responsibilities, and then we add on those officer responsibilities. So let's move on to the role of the board of directors. And I summed it up here. It's really one sentence that's in the legislative framework in most provinces and in the federal law when it comes to nonprofit. It also applies to basically any board of directors that is mandated by a government. All nonprofit, the board of directors mandate is to manage or oversee the management of the organization. And there's a key word here in this sentence. It's or. It either manages with a small organization, the board does everything, it has a few activities, doesn't need employees, might have some people do some contract work for finance, contract for work for coordinating activities, but the board will be doing everything. That's the manage. The board's primary responsibility is to manage, and when they don't, because they've named an officer called an executive director, they fall into the oversight of management of the organization, which ultimately means they are responsible for the organization in every single aspect, and they're overseeing the person who's responsible to deliver, so management, and they're also overseeing as a board the work of the other officers. So it's not the other way around. It's not the chair and the treasurer and the secretary of the board are overseeing the work of the board of directors. It's the directors that is overseeing the work of the officers, because the officers are doing the work for the board. All of the officers are working for the board. And that's why we're always looking for independent board members. So if we have 4 officers that can vote, VP, chair, vice chair, treasurer, secretary, we're going to expect that the board at least has 5 more directors, so they can actually have sort of balance of powers when it comes to voting, and they can oversee, they can assess the performance of these officers, because all of them are responsible for one part of management, whether it's finance for the treasurer, governance for the secretary, oversight of the executive director by the chair, and other responsibilities that the chair will have. We need to be able to assess their performance. So these 5 directors are overseeing the work of all of the officers, including the executive director. So let's move to the 4 ways the board can actually contribute to performance. And one of them is fostering a culture of accountability. And that comes from an accountability framework for the executive director. Sometimes it looks, I've got a few models I can share with you. It's just a template, a document we use with clients. It's basically just either part of a policy or a policy that's been adopted by the board of directors. It's a document that says, here, executive director, this is what we're expecting of you. And it's going to be translated in, key performance indicators for operations, key performance indicators for the strategic framework, and other elements that the board is expecting the executive director to report on. So by creating an accountability framework, we're creating a culture of accountability, because we're asking the executive director to move to the second part here, where I'm going to expect you to report on results, not on activities. Results are data-based, and they should be 80% of the report from the executive director. So as we're developing an accountability framework, we're actually going to be offering a results-based framework, so the executive director can give a reasonable assurance to the board that things are going well, not only in the mission and the programs and the services and everything going on in the business that we're in, but also when it comes to the strategic framework and moving and acting towards the mission that was established in the strategic framework. So all of this really creates a frame that it needs to be based on goals, obviously SMART goals if possible, that support the mission and the vision, and whoops, and also I'm lacking a little bullet right here. So SMART goals, these goals are set out in a strategic framework and an operational framework as well, that all of this will be included in a results-based accountability rather than an activity-based, that all fit into the accountability framework. And obviously, we need to give ongoing feedback to the executive director. And for most of our clients, it looks like this. There's all of the items on the agenda that are really routine, report from the ED, report from the treasurer, report from the secretary, report from the chair, all of these linked to the work of the committees. Then is there other business to be discussed? And then we're going to add, is there anything to communicate to other members, to stakeholders? And then we're going to add in-camera feedback for executive director. And basically, it's just we're asking the ED to leave the room so the board can have simple discussion on any constructive feedback that we could give to the executive director. It's noted by the chair and shared with the executive director within 24 to 48 hours after the board meeting. And it gives that feedback loop so we don't end up at the end of the year doing a full-fledged HR assessment of the performance of the executive director. We actually assess the performance of the executive director based on the performance of the organization. So we leave the more touchy-feely constructive criticism, constructive feedback on an ongoing basis at every single board meeting. So we're not stuck waiting till the end of the year to give some important information to the executive director so he or she can succeed. Then we're also going to ensure that we are also evaluating ourselves as a board. So can we at least assess the performance of meetings, of committees, maybe officers? I've seen some of our clients do using performance model for all of the officers, the executive director, obviously, but also committees and meetings. My recommendation is let's just do a quick feedback loop in a simple form to assess meetings, to make sure that meetings are really high in performance. And that's a really nice, simple way to create accountability around the table. So if we do start late every meeting, we can start, getting data on it and acting upon it as quickly as possible, and not let things fester that could create dysfunction on the board. So by being a model, I'm going to assess the board and its members at the same way I'm going to assess the performance of the executive director and the way we do things. So we are a model of accountability. So when it comes down to assessing the performance of the executive director, we're not sort of, just doing it willy-nilly. We're also making sure that we are accountable to ourselves and our role. The second thing is board efficiency and effectiveness. And we've seen many boards in dysfunction, not being able to work together with an agenda that is so out of tune with the work of the board and the work of the executive director. It changes every meeting. It needs to be more efficient. And so meetings are focused, they're efficient, they're centered on accountability, compliance, and diligence. So it's not a place to share information, it's a place to do oversight and do our work. So when we are receiving information, it's to give us the reasonable assurance that things are going well, and that should be done in a very efficient way. Every single officer reports on the work that's been done by their committee or by management, and in the end, we have all of this confirmation that we are compliant, that things are going well, and those things that are not going well have a plan to fix it, and everyone is reporting on the work that's been done between meetings. So in the end, we are all able to walk away from a meeting saying, this was efficient because I was able to do my due diligence, maintain reasonable assurance that things are going well, and make the very best decisions based on that information. So that's why the agenda needs to be recurring and structured in a way where there's a routine that's being developed. It shouldn't be a surprise. When the agenda is presented to everyone, obviously, we need a report from the executive director to give us that reasonable assurance that things are going well. So operational performance, strategic performance, risk management update, what's going on? Is there anything that's lurking that could be menacing the organization? We need to be aware of those. So that's the executive director's report. Then the treasurer's report from the audit and finance committee. Then the secretary's report, the governance secretary on the board should report on the governance committee's work. And then the chair should report on the work done in the compensation and ED evaluation committee. And that's a pretty simple way of working. And we end up in a routine where we know what's expected. No one's surprised by anything, because surprises is counterproductive to diligence. We're going to make sure that we are on a roll. We're in a flow when it comes to practicing good governance. We're also going to, reports are going to follow templates. They're easy to draft, they're easy to read, they're easy to understand, and they are sent well in advance. And it doesn't need to be very complicated. We have a few templates we could share with you, but you could use AI to really review or rework your templates. But every committee should be reporting on its mandate. For example, the governance committee should be reporting on compliance with different, roles, responsibilities, and obligation. The finance committee should be reporting on financial performance, risk management, all of that stuff. You know this stuff. So as we move along, these reports are just simple to read. We're used to them. There's enough information there so we can practice a reasonable diligence on the work that we're doing. We should have the information needed, and it should be easy to read. Board requests are reasonable and aligned with mission, vision, values. And this is where we could get stuck, where the board might think that it's the executive director's supervisor, and we're just going to tell her what to do on a regular basis, instead of making sure that there's an accountability framework where the executive director that's in the business day to day can move along towards meeting expectations without the board always coming up with new motions to deviate, distract, and move the executive director away from the mission, the vision, and the values. So we need to be reasonable in our expectations. So when we do request, it's always requested through a motion, or it's requested through recommendations that actually come out of committee's report that was recommended by some of the work that was done by either the committee in finance or governance or compensation committee, but also by the executive director, that often just comes to you with scenarios and comes to you with options on moving forward, on mitigating some risk, or on jumping onto an opportunity that would help us attain the vision quicker. All of this stuff is being done, and we should be able to be reasonable in our requests if we're adding or encouraging and moving things forward. So, and that brings me to the final point here, where am I respecting roles and responsibilities? Are they being upheld? Which means, am I respecting the role that the board of director has of staying above the line here when it comes to members giving a mandate to the board of directors to manage or oversee the organization or oversee management, and letting the executive director with all of these beautiful resources get things done? So if the board is actually respecting their role, they're going to stick to the what. They're going to stick to the strategic framework, to the accountability framework, to policy, to budget, to monitoring and oversight, to developing risk appetite to ensure that we're not stepping a bit too far when it comes to developing markets, programs, financing, and so on. We're going to let the executive director and its team move on the how. And so when I was in the previous slide here, I was saying respecting roles and responsibilities, it's being upheld through staying within the limits of our mandate. And staying within the limits of our mandate is saying my work stops here on this line as a member of the board of directors. So the only officer that is on this fence is the executive director. So they're going to come in and report to the board and then work with these people. They are the single point of contact when it comes to interaction between the organization and the board of directors, and obviously members as well. So everything that's below the line in the how is everything the executive director is responsible for, whether it's operations, procedures, strategic action plan, human resources, programs and services, finance, accounting, communication, IT, risk management, marketing, everything that's in there. So by doing, by listening, by doing some strong reporting and accountability work, the board is keeping its role in above the line here. And I think that's an important way to make sure that the board doesn't end up in the kitchen. I think the expression most people like is nose in, fingers out. We need to stay out of the executive director's way because we're just spending about 60 hours a year together as a board of directors. This person is spending between 1750 to almost 2,500 hours a year in the organization. We can't be up to speed on everything and involved in everything. So let's just keep to our mandate and do the oversight that works to maintain a reasonable assurance that things are going well. The third one is obvious. I think it's obvious for everyone, but it's not always easy to set into motion. It's the effective communication piece. And I think we get stuck with this in board meetings sometimes, where we think that a board meeting is a communications tool and we're going to be exchanging information, and we share it in a, I don't know, executive director's word or the chair's initial comments, and it ends up using the first half hour to put stuff that probably should have been in an email, especially for those board members who might have been late or are absent for that board meeting. So one of the ways to maintain effective communications is that we need to find other ways to communicate information that is not linked to the work of the board. So staying informed about the organization is not the same work as being a board member, doing oversight, maintaining reasonable assurance that things are going well. So can we find a way, and most of our clients do find a way, by communicating and staying informed in the regular newsletter, or maybe a simple email that's sent monthly from the executive director to the chair and to the board members, just to keep them in touch with what's going on. It has nothing to do with accountability. It has everything to do with making meetings more efficient by keeping the information items outside of the board of directors meeting. Also, documentation is concise and supports the board's work. And I think this is a key component. And it's the board's role to ensure that the executive director isn't overloading you with information and making it even harder to make a decision. So we need to be able to really, those templates I was talking about earlier, they really need to be concise, and they need to be adopted by everyone that's reporting to the board. So if you find as a board that you're being overloaded with information and you can't get ready for a board meeting, it might be an opportunity to sit down with the governance committee or the or even the compensation committee to make sure that the reporting stays concise. Also, reports need to focus on results and performance, not activities. And I don't want to be rude to any executive directors out there. I respect you for what you do, but in the end, it's not the board's business whether you're busy or not. It's the board business whether you meet expectations or not. And busy is not a KPI. So to make sure that the reporting doesn't become a look how busy I am as an executive director, and that's why I might not be meeting expectations. It needs to become, this is how I'm meeting expectations, and here's the proof. It's in my dashboard, it's in my scorecard, it's the first line in my reporting. I have operational scorecard, and I also have a strategic scorecard. And if ever I have time, I might take a moment or two and explain to the board, the big activities that are going on in the organization, but that can't be the lead information in my reports. So reports focus on results and performance, not activities. So it's much quicker in the work that's being done by the ED, but it's also much quicker to get to reasonable assurance that things are going well by the board of directors. Also, there needs to be only one point of contact, and I know we did a full webinar on that topic with Jim Brown a few months ago, and Jim's the author of the book The Imperfect Board Member. But there needs to be a very specific protocol when it comes to communicating with the executive director. And the reason I'm putting it right here as it is, so only one point of contact between the board and the organization, it's the executive director so the board as a unit. So it's only one point of contact between the board and the organization. It's the executive director. So it can't be every board member's writing to the executive director every single week with 3 or 4 questions. This is the opposite of efficiency. This is the opposite of contributing. It's actually distracting the executive director. And this is a real thing. I've seen, we've discussed with clients in the past that we're spending at least a week per board meeting just prepping, communicating, reporting, logistics, 1 week as an executive director per board meeting, and they would have 12 meetings a year. So you do the math. 1 week, 12 board meetings, that's almost 3 months just focusing on the board. And whereas the executive director's work is to focus on the organization and its performance. So let's make sure that there's only one point of contact between the board and the organization, and that should be the executive director, and everything goes through that flow. And the only thing that might not go through that flow is if there's a complaint against the executive director, there should be a process in your policy where they could have where information or complaints can be submitted to the board in a due process. Last one, that's my favorite. That's really getting the board involved. That's really making sure that every volunteer around the table is actually making a difference within their competency, is making sure that committees succeed. And the success of committees is if they fulfill their mandate with minimal involvement from the executive director, you will have a board of directors that actually makes a difference. And if they stay in their lane, whether it's finance for the audit committee, governance, so governance compliance for and policy for the governance committee, and the oversight compensation committee for the executive director, we're really going to have a board that is creating balance during board meetings. Because I've observed many board meetings that actually look like executive director meetings, but they're not executive director meetings. They're board meetings. And during board meetings, while it should be balanced out, at least 20% of the work needs to be done with regards to the treasurer's work, with regards to the governance secretary's work, with regards to the chair and the compensation committee's work. And that's 60% of the meeting. Then maybe 40% of the meeting on operations, oversight, reporting on strategic framework. And that gives you a nice balanced meeting where volunteers that actually got things done in committees have a space to express, share, validate, value the work that they're doing as volunteers. So if committees fulfill their mandate with minimal involvement of the executive director, when committees report to the board on their work and on their work and resolutions that were sent to them by the board. No committee operates at the operational level, so there's no communications committee or programming or logo redesign committee or procedure drafting committee. All of our committees are in finance and audit, in governance, in compensation, and those are the only committees that really can develop a true purpose around the table. Each officer should lead their own committee. And it's really a simple model where the governance secretary, so secretary of the board, should be chairing the governance committee. Treasurer should be chairing the finance committee, and the chair, being the single point of contact with the executive director, should be leading the compensation committee. And the compensation committee is, and we'll go into the mandates in a few moments, as they do their work, they're able to, one, report per officer, as I was saying earlier, 60% from board officers and 40% from operations or management officers. And it's aligned with their area of responsibilities. And this is what it looks like. So the three main committees: Finance, Audit, Risk Management, Internal Controls Committee. They monitor and review financial statements. They develop and recommend an annual budget with the executive director and the finance staff. They do oversight on investment management and monitor performance. They manage the relationship with the external auditor and review audit reports. They ensure audit recommendations are implemented. They review internal controls to prevent fraud and ensure integrity of financial processes and maybe others. They identify, assess, and monitor risk, financial, operational, strategic. They have that file. Sometimes it's in the governance committee. Most of the time it's in the finance and risk management committee. And also they develop, review, and update financial management and administrative policies. So the overarching policies of the organization usually would go through for an approval by the audit and finance committee. So here you can see that when the treasurer is presenting stuff, no need to use the executive director. They can report on what the committee was doing. So it's a much more active role as a volunteer when you're the treasurer and you're working with the committee on moving these things forward. And as you could probably guess, as I'm moving forward on this, is that when you are recruiting board members, you're also recruiting people to sit on these committees. So remember my 9 board members, ballpark? That's a perfect number for it, because we have 3 officers and 6 people that can sit on these committees. So when we have 3 people per committee, all of this work can be done in 4 meetings a year. So if we have 4 board meetings, maybe 5 per year, reporting quarterly plus 1 before or after the AGM, we're going to have a very beautiful flow in the governance calendar where every committee meets between every board meeting. The board meeting is right after a quarter. So after the first quarter, every committee will have met. And then we have a nice flow where every board meeting, we get a report from all 3 committees and the report from the executive director. Let's move on. Governance, board functioning, and compliance committee. They develop, review, update governance policy. They ensure board and organizational compliance with applicable laws and regulations. They manage the annual evaluation of the board, its members, its officers. They organize onboarding and training for new board members. They monitor and maintain the effectiveness of the board and its committees. They ensure the code of conduct and ethics rules are followed and signed yearly, and they maintain a board skills matrix and lead board recruitment to ensure that we have the right people in the right seats around the table. And whether you're a small nonprofit or a large nonprofit, this work can be done. And when we recruit for competencies versus recruiting just for volunteers, it really changes the dynamics of recruitment. It certainly increases the number of candidates for most of our clients. Last but not least, the executive support or coaching, evaluation, and compensation committee. often called the HR committee or just simply the compensation committee. This is usually led by the chair and vice chair sometimes, and other board members that are stronger in management. They evaluate the executive director's annual performance based on the accountability framework. They recommend the executive director's compensation and benefits to the board. They establish and monitor the ED's accountability framework. They lead the recruitment process for the ED. They develop and update the succession plan for the executive director to ensure smooth transitions and that they're replaced if they need to very quickly if need be. And they also lead the strategic planning process in collaboration with the executive director and stakeholders, and they integrate it into the executive director's framework. So the accountability framework. So as you can see, all of these mandates really fit under the leadership responsibilities of the officers, and it brings everyone to take it up a notch when it comes to meetings. So if we really want to make a difference on a board, well, we're going to sit on one of these committees and maybe eventually even lead on one of these committees to ensure that when we do get to quarterly board meetings, they're active, they are based on reporting, compliance, confirming that things are moving along and we have an effective implementation of the mission, and we're actually making a difference through creating the very best organization for our community. And that's the ultimate goal, because the responsibility of the board is to oversee the organization. The product of the board is the very best organization possible for the stakeholders. So in the end, that's how we make a difference, is making sure that all of these job sites for the board are really, really active. And when they are, people feel involved. They don't feel like they're just sitting at a meeting, because you can imagine as a board member, if you sat on a compensation committee when they're presenting the accountability framework, you're listening in. And you're supporting and you're answering questions and you're justifying, explaining how we got to this rationale or how we got to this recommendation. And if everyone sits on a committee and every committee reports at every meeting, it completely changes the dynamics. We're almost done. It's not too bad. I did it within the hour. I hope this was useful. I'm going to just move a bit forward. There's 4 more webinars coming up in the next month. As you know, we do these every 2 weeks. There's 2 in leadership, the essential practices for managers in unionized environments. It might be useful for someone in your network. Please share those webinars that are on our website as well. Change management and emotional intelligence, how they are inseparable. That's on April 22nd. And we'll also have 2 governance webinars coming up. The 5 habits of a responsible board. We're doing that with our favorite lawyer, Pamela Taylor. And we will also have, is your organization performing? How do you know? We're actually going to show an accountability framework, dashboards, what an executive director report should look like, and how do we interpret it and use it to make the very best decisions. So hopefully it was useful for you today, and I'm inviting you to put in the chat maybe 1 word to sum up your webinar this evening. I want to thank you for being there, and we'll see you next time.